Charles Bennett sat in his dimly lit study, the warmth of the fire doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within him. Since the tragic loss of his wife, Eleanor, during childbirth, the once vibrant mansion had become a mausoleum of sorrow. The only sounds that filled the halls were the faint cries of their newborn son, Thomas, a child burdened with a rare and debilitating illness. Desperation drove Charles to hire a young woman named Sarah, whose kind eyes and gentle demeanor promised the care that his fragile son so desperately needed. Yet, beneath his decision lay a growing paranoia, one that had led him to install cameras in every room of the house, watching every move with an obsession born of grief and fear. Sarah's arrival was met with a mixture of hope and suspicion. She was a breath of fresh air in the stifling gloom of the mansion, her presence bringing a softness that Charles hadn't felt in months. He watched her closely through the surveillance system, searching for any sign of deceit or neglect. But each night, as he reviewed the footage, all he saw was a woman who treated Thomas with a tenderness that made his heart ache. She would sing lullabies, her voice a soothing balm that seemed to ease not just Thomas's discomfort, but the heavy weight of loss that pressed on Charles's chest. Still, he could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. Days passed in a blur of monotony, with Sarah caring for Thomas while Charles immersed himself in his nightly ritual of surveillance. His distrust, however, was not easily quelled. There was something in the way Sarah looked at Thomas, a depth of emotion that unsettled him. It wasn't just the care of a nanny for her charge. It was something more profound, more intimate. It was as if she saw in Thomas something that even Charles, his own father, could not. This realization gnawed at him, planting seeds of doubt that began to take root in his already troubled mind. One evening, as Charles reviewed the day's recordings, he noticed something strange. Sarah was sitting beside Thomas's crib, her hand gently stroking his cheek, her expression one of serene concentration. For a moment, her face softened in a way that seemed almost reverential, as if she were in the presence of something sacred. Charles leaned closer to the screen, his breath catching in his throat. What was it that she saw in his son that he did not? The question lingered, fueling his suspicion and deepening the rift between what he observed and what he understood. Charles began to study Sarah more intently, his curiosity morphing into a fixation. He scrutinized every detail, the way she held Thomas, the words she whispered when she thought no one was listening, the moments when she seemed to lose herself in thought while gazing at the child. His mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Could it be that Sarah had some connection to his son that he was unaware of? Or was she merely a woman with a deep sense of empathy, one that he, in his grief-stricken state, could not comprehend? The line between reality and paranoia blurred as he grappled with these thoughts. The cameras, once a source of comfort, became a double-edged sword. They provided Charles with a window into his son's life, but they also fed his growing anxiety. He would sit for hours, watching the same footage over and over, searching for something, anything, that would explain the unease that gnawed at him. But all he found was more questions, and with each passing day, his distrust deepened. The weight of his grief and the fear of losing Thomas clouded his judgment, making it increasingly difficult for him to see the situation with clarity. Sarah, unaware of the turmoil she had stirred in Charles, continued to care for Thomas with unwavering dedication. Her gentle nature and the bond she seemed to share with the child should have been a source of reassurance, but instead, they only heightened Charles's fears. He could not bring himself to confront her directly, afraid of what her answers might reveal. The uncertainty of it all was maddening, and Charles felt himself slipping further into a spiral of doubt and suspicion. The mansion, once a place of love and happiness, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on him as the weight of his emotions became unbearable. Despite his growing distrust, Charles could not deny that Thomas seemed to thrive under Sarah's care. The child, who had been so weak and fragile, appeared to grow stronger each day, his cries becoming less frequent, his sleep more peaceful. It was as if Sarah's presence was having a tangible effect on his health, a thought that both comforted and terrified Charles. Could it be that there was more to Sarah than met the eye? Was she truly the caring nanny she appeared to be? Or was there something more sinister at play? The questions haunted him, keeping him awake at night as he wrestled with his own fears. As the days turned into weeks, Charles found himself at a crossroads. His rational mind told him that he was being paranoid, that Sarah was simply a devoted caretaker who had formed a bond with his son. But his heart, still raw from the loss of Eleanor, could not accept this. He had lost too much already, and the thought of losing Thomas as well was more than he could bear. Yet, he could not deny the changes he saw in his son, the subtle signs that something extraordinary was happening. Torn between fear and hope, Charles knew that he had to make a decision, one that would determine the future of not just his son, but his own fragile sanity. In the end, Charles's decision was driven by the most primal of emotions, love. Despite his fears, despite his doubts, he could not bring himself to push Sarah away. She was, after all, the only one who had been able to reach Thomas in a way that even he could not. And so, with a heart heavy with uncertainty, Charles chose to let her stay, hoping against hope that he was making the right choice. But even as he did, the nagging feeling that something was not quite right remained, a constant reminder that the line between love and fear is often thinner than we realize. The days began to blend together in a soothing, almost hypnotic rhythm. Sarah quickly settled into her role, caring for Thomas with a level of devotion that both comforted and unsettled Charles. Each morning, she would cradle the fragile infant in her arms, her soft hums filling the room with a sense of calm that seemed to wash over the entire household. Thomas, once so restless and agitated, responded to her touch with an almost miraculous serenity. It was as if she possessed a secret knowledge, an instinctive understanding of how to bring peace to the ailing child, and for a time, Charles allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, things might turn out all right. Sarah's presence became a balm to the wounded household. The mansion, long steeped in grief and silence, began to show signs of life again. The once oppressive atmosphere lightened as Sarah's gentle voice and tender care seemed to breathe new energy into the walls that had witnessed so much sorrow. Even the staff, who had grown accustomed to the somber mood of their employer, found themselves softening in her presence. Yet, despite the apparent tranquility that Sarah brought, Charles could not entirely let go of his apprehension. He continued his nightly ritual of watching the surveillance footage, his eyes scanning every detail for any sign of danger. Night after night, Charles reviewed the recordings with meticulous care. He watched as Sarah tended to Thomas, her actions precise and full of genuine affection. There were no hidden agendas, no moments of negligence, just the steady, unwavering care of a woman who seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to soothe the child. Yet, as comforting as this was, Charles couldn't shake the nagging doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. The way Sarah looked at Thomas, with such deep affection and something else, something he couldn't quite name, continued to unsettle him. What was it that she saw in his son that he did not? Despite his growing unease, Charles found it increasingly difficult to deny the positive changes in Thomas. The child who had once been so fragile now seemed to gain strength with each passing day. His cries, once so frequent and desperate, were now rare, replaced by soft coos and peaceful sleep. Sarah's care had brought about a transformation in Thomas that no doctor had been able to achieve, and for that, Charles was grateful. Yet, with this gratitude came an uncomfortable question. Was it possible that Sarah's presence in their lives was not just a coincidence? Could there be something more to the bond she seemed to share with his son? As the days wore on, Charles began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes in Sarah as well. She moved through the house with a quiet confidence, her steps light and purposeful. There was a serenity about her that was almost otherworldly, as if she carried within her a deep well of calm that she could draw upon at will. It was a quality that Charles found both reassuring and unnerving. He couldn't help but wonder what it was that gave her such peace. Was it simply her nature, or was there something more? Something that he, in his grief-stricken state, could not see or understand. One evening, as Charles watched the footage from the previous day, he noticed something that gave him pause. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. As Sarah held Thomas, her face close to his, there was a moment, a fleeting second, where she seemed to whisper something in his ear. Charles rewound the footage, playing the moment over and over, trying to catch the words, but the sound was too faint to be heard. The gesture was tender, almost loving, and yet, it left Charles with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. What could she possibly be saying to his son? Despite his reservations, Charles could not deny the impact Sarah had on Thomas. The child was thriving under her care in a way that defied explanation. His once pale complexion now held a hint of color, his frail body gaining strength. Sarah's presence had brought about a change that was nothing short of miraculous, and yet, the more Thomas improved, the more Charles's anxiety grew. It was as if the very thing that should have brought him peace only served to deepen his fear. What if this newfound health was only temporary? What if, in the end, he lost everything all over again? The peaceful routine that had settled over the household was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it brought a sense of normalcy that had been absent for so long. On the other, it served as a constant reminder of how fragile that normalcy truly was. Charles found himself caught in a cycle of hope and fear, each day a struggle to balance the two. He wanted to believe that everything would be all right, that Thomas would continue to grow stronger, but the weight of his grief and the ever-present doubt gnawed at him, refusing to let him find true peace. As the days turned into weeks, Charles found himself increasingly drawn to the recordings, watching them not just for reassurance, but out of a growing sense of curiosity. What was it about Sarah that allowed her to connect with Thomas in a way that even he, his own father, could not? The question haunted him, pulling him deeper into his nightly ritual. Each time he watched, he hoped to find an answer, but all he found were more questions. The peaceful routine that had once seemed like a gift now felt like a puzzle he could not solve, and with each passing day, the pieces seemed to slip further from his grasp. The tranquility that had settled over the Bennett household began to fray at the edges as the nights grew longer. It was during one of these late-night surveillance sessions that Charles first noticed something amiss. The footage, which had become a ritualistic part of his evening routine, initially seemed as uneventful as ever. Sarah was in the nursery, sitting beside Thomas's crib, her presence a calming influence on the fragile child. But as the hours crept past midnight, something shifted. Sarah's usual stillness gave way to an odd behavior. She began to whisper to Thomas in the dead of night, her voice low and rhythmic, as if chanting some ancient lullaby. At first, Charles dismissed it as nothing more than a soothing technique, a way to comfort the restless infant. But as he continued to watch, he noticed that Sarah's words were not the simple, soft phrases she had used before. There was a cadence to her speech that was almost hypnotic, and though the audio was too faint to make out clearly, Charles could sense that these were not ordinary lullabies. The whispers seemed to weave through the air like a spell, a language unknown to him, but filled with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Who was she speaking to, and what was she saying? The more Charles watched, the more uneasy he became. He rewound the footage, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized every detail. Sarah's posture was different, more rigid, her gaze fixed not on Thomas, but on something unseen, something beyond the scope of the camera's lens. She was not just whispering to the child. She was conversing with someone, or something, that Charles could not see. The realization hit him like a cold wave, and his heart pounded in his chest as 1,000 questions flooded his mind. Was this some kind of delusion, a manifestation of her grief for her own lost child? Or was there truly another presence in the room? As the nights wore on, Charles became increasingly obsessed with these strange occurrences. Each evening, after Sarah had retired to her quarters, he would replay the footage, watching the scenes unfold with mounting dread. The whispers continued, growing more fervent with each passing night, as if Sarah was engaged in a dialogue with a force that only she could perceive. The nursery, once a place of quiet and safety, now seemed like a stage for something otherworldly, and Charles's fear deepened with every viewing. He began to dread the nights, knowing that each one would bring more questions, more mysteries that he could not explain. Charles's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was Sarah truly communicating with a spirit, perhaps the ghost of her deceased child? Or was she losing her grip on reality, descending into madness? The thought of confronting her filled him with both fear and determination. He needed to know the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. But how could he approach her without sounding like a madman himself? The tension built within him like a coiled spring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The peaceful routine that had once brought him comfort was now a source of relentless anxiety. One night, unable to bear the suspense any longer, Charles decided to stay awake and observe the nursery in real time. He sat in his study, the monitors glowing in the darkness, his eyes fixed on the screen as the hours ticked by. At first, everything was as it had always been. Sarah, sitting by the crib, her hand resting on Thomas's small chest, her lips moving in those strange, soft whispers. But then, just as the clock struck 3, something happened that made Charles's blood run cold. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, flickered across the wall behind Sarah, as if cast by a figure standing just out of view. But there was no one else in the room. Charles froze, his breath catching in his throat as he leaned closer to the screen. The shadow moved, its form shifting as it seemed to draw nearer to Sarah. She did not react, continuing to murmur her strange words, her focus entirely on Thomas. The shadow loomed larger, more defined, until it was as though another presence stood beside her, invisible to the naked eye but captured by the relentless gaze of the camera. Charles's hands trembled as he watched, fear gripping him with a force he hadn't felt since the day Eleanor had died. What was happening in that room? Desperate for answers, Charles spent the next day researching the history of the house, looking for any clue that might explain the strange phenomena he had witnessed. The mansion, though grand and stately, had its share of dark secrets, including rumors of hauntings and tragedies that had befallen previous occupants. But nothing he found could account for what he had seen. Nothing that made sense of the shadowy figure or the whispers that seemed to call out to something beyond the living. The more he searched, the more lost he felt, as if he were slipping further into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Charles's fear began to consume him, affecting his interactions with Sarah. He found himself watching her not just through the cameras, but in person, scrutinizing her every move, every word. He noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor, the way her eyes seemed distant at times, as if she were seeing something he could not. The tension between them grew, an unspoken understanding that something was deeply wrong, but neither dared to voice it. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground of emotions and unseen forces, and Charles was no longer sure who or what he could trust. The tension in the Bennett household had reached a breaking point. Charles could no longer ignore the strange occurrences that had been plaguing his nights, nor the growing sense of unease that twisted his stomach into knots. The shadow, the whispers, and Sarah's increasingly peculiar behavior all pointed to something that defied rational explanation. Driven by a need for answers, Charles decided it was time to confront Sarah directly, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his resolve. He waited until the house was quiet, the staff retired to their quarters, and only the soft ticking of the clock filled the silence. That night, Charles approached the nursery with trepidation, his footsteps echoing softly in the dimly lit hallway. As he neared the door, he could hear Sarah's voice, a low murmur that sent a shiver down his spine. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, casting long shadows across the walls. Sarah was seated beside Thomas's crib, her back to him, her voice continuing in that strange, melodic whisper. "Sarah," Charles called out, his voice rough with tension. She stiffened, her whispering abruptly ceasing as she turned to face him. Her expression was one of surprise, quickly masked by a calm that only deepened Charles's unease. He could see the fatigue etched into her features, the dark circles under her eyes, and the way she held herself, as if carrying a weight that was too heavy to bear alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "I need to know what's been happening. I've seen things on the cameras. I need to understand." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at his words, a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, crossing her face before she quickly looked away. She hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her apron, before letting out a shaky breath. I didn't want to alarm you, Mr. Bennett," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but there's something you need to know. At night, when I'm here with Thomas, I feel a presence that I can't explain. It's as if my own child, who I lost so many years ago, is here with us. I know it sounds insane, but I can feel him. I can feel him protecting Thomas." Charles felt a chill run down his spine at her words. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows longer, as he processed what she had just told him. 1,000 questions raced through his mind, but one stood out above the rest. "Sarah, are you saying that you believe your son's spirit is here, with Thomas?" His voice was barely above a whisper, his disbelief palpable. Sarah nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes as she spoke. "I know it sounds crazy, but I believe it with all my heart. I've felt his presence every night since I started caring for Thomas. He's here, Mr. Bennett. He's watching over him." The weight of her words settled heavily on Charles's shoulders, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to grief and a mother's desperate longing for her lost child. But the things he had seen, the shadow, the whispers, the way Thomas seemed to calm in Sarah's presence, made it impossible for him to simply ignore her claims. There was a part of him, a small, frightened part, that wanted to believe her. But how could he? How could he accept something so far beyond the realm of reason? For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence, the only sound the soft, rhythmic breathing of Thomas as he slept peacefully in his crib. Finally, Charles found his voice again, though it was strained and uncertain. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he asked, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. Sarah looked down, her shoulders slumping slightly as she responded. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. And even if you did, what could we do? How could we possibly explain something like this? I didn't want to add to your burden, especially after everything you've already been through." Charles clenched his fists, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wanted to be angry, to accuse her of toying with his already fragile state of mind. But the sincerity in her voice, the raw emotion in her eyes, made it impossible for him to dismiss her words out of hand. He knew grief. He knew the desperate lengths it could drive a person to. But this was something else entirely. "Sarah, if what you're saying is true, if your son's spirit is really here, then why? Why would he be drawn to Thomas?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that neither of them dared to voice. Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing as she struggled to find the right words. "I don't know," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible, "but I think he's here because he knows Thomas needs protection. Maybe he sees him as a brother, someone he can care for in a way he never got the chance to in life. Or maybe he's here to help both of us, to bring some kind of peace to our lives. I can't pretend to understand it, Mr. Bennett. All I know is that I can feel his love, and it's the same love I feel for Thomas." Charles felt a lump form in his throat, the raw emotion in Sarah's words cutting through his skepticism like a knife. Could it really be possible? Could there be forces at work in this house that he had never imagined? The thought both terrified and intrigued him, stirring a deep, primal part of his soul that he had long since buried. But even as he stood on the brink of accepting this new reality, doubt still gnawed at him, refusing to let go. "Sarah, I don't know what to believe," he confessed, his voice breaking slightly. "But if what you're saying is true, what do we do now?" The conversation with Sarah left Charles in a state of turmoil. The revelation that his home might be host to something beyond the realm of the living shook him to his core. For days, he wandered the halls of his mansion, his mind trapped in a relentless loop of questions and doubts. Logic told him that what Sarah claimed was impossible, that ghosts and spirits were nothing more than the figments of a grief-stricken imagination. But the evidence before him, the shadow, the whispers, the inexplicable calm that had come over Thomas, challenged every rational belief he held. He found himself teetering on the edge of two worlds, one grounded in reason, the other in faith. As the days passed, the struggle between these opposing forces grew more intense. Charles was a man of science, of logic and reason. He had built his fortune on calculated risks and well-thought-out decisions, never allowing emotion or superstition to cloud his judgment. But this was something he couldn't explain, something that defied all logic. Every fiber of his being wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, to chalk it up to Sarah's grief and his own desperate need to believe in something beyond the pain of loss. But the image of that shadow, the way Thomas had grown stronger under Sarah's care, it all lingered in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. Charles sought answers in the only way he knew how, by turning to experts. He arranged for Thomas to be seen by a specialist, someone who could provide a clear, scientific explanation for his sudden improvement. The doctor, a renowned pediatrician, ran a battery of tests, examining every aspect of Thomas's health with the precision of a seasoned professional. But when the results came back, they offered no answers. Physically, Thomas was still as frail as ever, his condition unchanged despite the outward signs of improvement. The doctor, baffled, could only offer a vague explanation about the power of the human mind and the potential effects of a nurturing environment. It was not enough to satisfy Charles's need for clarity. The lack of answers only deepened Charles's inner conflict. He found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Was it possible that there were forces at work that science could not explain? Could faith and belief in the unseen hold more power than he had ever imagined? These thoughts terrified him, shaking the very foundation of his identity. He had always prided himself on being a man of reason, but now, reason seemed to be failing him. The world he had carefully constructed around himself was crumbling, leaving him vulnerable and exposed to the unknown. Sarah, too, felt the weight of Charles's struggle. She continued to care for Thomas with the same gentle devotion, but she could sense the turmoil that gripped the man who had hired her. She saw it in the way he looked at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else, something she couldn't quite place. She wanted to comfort him, to offer him the solace that her faith had brought her, but she knew that his battle was one he had to fight on his own. All she could do was be there for Thomas and hope that in time, Charles would find the peace he so desperately sought. As the tension within Charles grew, so did the strange occurrences in the house. The whispers at night became more frequent, the shadows more pronounced. There were times when Charles could swear he heard faint laughter, the soft giggle of a child echoing through the halls. It was as if the house itself was alive, responding to the emotions of its inhabitants. These experiences only served to deepen Charles's sense of unease. He could no longer deny that something was happening, something that went beyond the physical world. But what it was, and what it wanted, he could not say. The struggle between reason and faith began to take its toll on Charles's health. He slept little, his nights plagued by dreams of shadows and whispers, his days filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. He found himself withdrawing from the world, avoiding contact with the few friends and colleagues who still reached out to him. The mansion, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on him as he wrestled with the impossible. He knew he needed to make a decision, to either embrace the unknown or find a way to banish it from his life. But the fear of making the wrong choice paralyzed him. In his darkest moments, Charles would retreat to the nursery, standing over Thomas's crib as the child slept peacefully. He would watch Sarah as she cared for his son, her movements graceful and serene, her presence a beacon of calm in the storm that raged within him. He envied her faith, her ability to believe in something so deeply that it brought her peace. But he also feared it. What if she was wrong? What if this belief, this faith, was leading them down a dangerous path? The uncertainty gnawed at him, tearing at the fragile threads of his sanity. The turning point came one night as Charles stood in the nursery, watching Sarah as she sang softly to Thomas. The shadows seemed to gather around them, thick and heavy, and for a moment, he felt as if he could see them. Shapes moving in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the light. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening as the familiar fear gripped him. But this time, something was different. As he watched, the fear began to melt away, replaced by a strange sense of calm. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he felt a connection to something greater than himself, something that transcended reason and logic. Charles didn't understand what was happening to him, but he knew that he could no longer fight it. The struggle between reason and faith had taken him to the brink, and now, standing at the edge of the abyss, he realized that he had to let go. He had to trust in something beyond his understanding, something that could not be measured or explained. It was a terrifying prospect, but it was also liberating. For the first time in months, Charles felt a sense of peace, a peace that came not from answers, but from acceptance. He didn't have to understand everything. He just had to believe. The night that would change everything began like so many others, with Charles sitting alone in his study, the glow of the surveillance monitors casting an eerie light across the room. He had spent hours poring over the footage, replaying the same scenes over and over, searching for something, anything, that would offer a concrete explanation for the events that had turned his life upside down. But tonight, his exhaustion had finally caught up with him. His eyelids grew heavy, and despite his efforts to stay awake, he drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams a chaotic swirl of shadows and whispers. Charles awoke with a start, his heart racing as he tried to shake off the lingering remnants of his dream. It took him a moment to realize that something had pulled him from sleep, something real. He glanced at the monitors, and his breath caught in his throat. The nursery camera, which had been so quiet, was now showing something impossible. There, in the soft glow of the nightlight, stood a figure. A small, translucent figure that could only be described as ghostly. The childlike apparition was standing beside Thomas's crib, its tiny hand resting on the edge as it gazed down at the sleeping infant. Panic surged through Charles as he scrambled to his feet, knocking over his chair in his haste. He didn't stop to think, didn't try to rationalize what he was seeing. All he knew was that he had to get to Thomas. He bolted from his study, his footsteps echoing through the silent house as he raced down the hall to the nursery. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand trembling on the doorknob. A part of him feared what he might find on the other side, but his concern for his son overrode everything else. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The scene that greeted him was both surreal and terrifying. Sarah was standing by the crib, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with shock. She was staring at the same spot Charles had seen on the monitor, the place where the ghostly figure had stood. But now, as he looked closer, he realized that the figure was gone. The room was quiet, save for the soft, steady breathing of Thomas as he slept peacefully, oblivious to the turmoil around him. Charles felt his legs give out beneath him, and he collapsed into the nearest chair, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Charles's eyes remained fixed on the crib, as if expecting the apparition to return at any moment. But the room remained still, the only movement the gentle rise and fall of Thomas's chest. Finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she whispered, her gaze still locked on the crib. Charles nodded slowly, unable to trust his voice. The fear that had gripped him earlier had not entirely dissipated, but now it was mingled with something else, something he couldn't quite name. Sarah turned to face him, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "That was my son," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that glistened in her eyes. "I don't know how or why, but he's here, Mr. Bennet. He's here, and he's protecting Thomas." Charles wanted to argue, wanted to cling to the last shreds of logic and reason that had governed his life for so long. But he couldn't, not after what he had seen with his own eyes. The reality of the situation was undeniable, and with that realization came a flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of what had happened settled over Charles like a heavy blanket. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of a precipice, his entire world about to change. The fear that had once paralyzed him was now giving way to something else, a deep, abiding sense of connection to forces he had never believed in, forces that defied explanation but were no less real. He looked at Sarah, seeing her not just as the nanny he had hired in desperation, but as a mother who had found a way to protect both her child and his, even from beyond the grave. The next moments felt like they stretched into eternity. Charles knew he had to make a decision, one that would define not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in the house. He could no longer deny the presence that had made itself known, nor could he continue to live in fear of it. He had to choose between clinging to his old ways of thinking or embracing the unknown, between fear and faith. The choice was clear, but that didn't make it any easier. Taking a deep breath, he reached out and took Sarah's hand, his grip firm despite the trembling of his fingers. "We'll face this together," he said quietly, his voice stronger than he felt. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something that looked like relief. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Charles felt a sense of purpose, a sense of rightness in the decision he had made. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know how they would navigate the strange and terrifying world that had revealed itself to them. But he knew that they wouldn't have to face it alone. And that, he realized, was enough. As the night wore on, Charles and Sarah sat together in the nursery, watching over Thomas as he slept. The fear that had once gripped Charles had faded, replaced by a calm acceptance of the reality they now faced. The figure had not returned, but its presence lingered in the room, a silent guardian watching over the child they both loved. Charles knew that this was only the beginning, that there were still many questions left unanswered. But for now, he allowed himself to simply be in the moment, to feel the peace that had settled over the house like a warm blanket. In the days that followed the startling encounter, a profound change began to take root within Charles. The mansion, once a place of sorrow and fear, slowly transformed into a sanctuary of peace and acceptance. The events of that night had shattered his carefully constructed worldview, but in the wreckage, Charles found something unexpected: hope. The fear that had once dominated his every thought was now replaced by a quiet faith, a belief that there was more to the world than he had ever imagined. It was a faith that brought him solace in the face of the unknown, and with it came a sense of renewal. Charles's newfound acceptance extended beyond the supernatural presence in his home. It seeped into his relationships, particularly with Sarah. The bond that had formed between them was no longer just that of employer and employee. It was something deeper, forged in the shared experience of the extraordinary. They began to talk more openly, sharing their thoughts and fears, their hopes and dreams. Sarah confided in Charles about her son, about the pain of losing him and the comfort she now felt in knowing that he was still with her in some form. Charles, in turn, opened up about Eleanor, about the guilt and grief that had consumed him since her death. The more they shared, the closer they became. There was no need for pretense between them, no need to hide behind the masks they had worn for so long. In Sarah, Charles found someone who understood his pain, someone who had walked a similar path of loss and had emerged on the other side with her faith intact. And in Charles, Sarah found someone who, despite his initial skepticism, had come to embrace the truth of her experience. Their connection grew stronger with each passing day, rooted in mutual respect and a deepening understanding of the mysteries that bound them together. Thomas, too, continued to thrive under Sarah's care. The improvement in his health, once inexplicable, now seemed almost miraculous. The child who had been so frail and weak was now full of life, his laughter echoing through the halls of the mansion like a beacon of joy. Charles marveled at the transformation, no longer questioning the how or why, but simply accepting it as a gift, one that he was determined to cherish. He spent more time with his son, holding him, playing with him, and marveling at the small milestones that, not long ago, had seemed impossible. The bond between father and son grew stronger, healing wounds that Charles had thought would never mend. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the Bennett mansion grew lighter, the oppressive weight of grief and fear lifting like a fog. The staff, who had once moved about the house with quiet reservation, now found themselves smiling more, engaging in light-hearted conversations as they went about their duties. The change in Charles was evident to all who knew him. He was no longer the cold, distant man who had isolated himself in his sorrow. He was becoming someone new, someone who had learned to let go of his need for control and to trust in the unseen forces that had brought such unexpected blessings into his life. The presence that had once filled Charles with dread now brought him comfort. He no longer feared the shadows or the whispers that occasionally drifted through the halls at night. Instead, he welcomed them, acknowledging them as part of the strange and beautiful reality that had become his life. He found himself talking to the unseen presence, not out of fear, but out of a sense of connection. He would whisper words of gratitude into the quiet of the night, thanking the spirit for watching over Thomas, for bringing peace to his home, and for guiding him through the darkest days of his life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the estate, Charles stood by the window of his study, looking out over the sprawling gardens. The landscape, once a reflection of his inner turmoil, now seemed to mirror the peace that had settled in his heart. The flowers, once wilted and neglected, were now in full bloom, their vibrant colors a testament to the renewal that had taken place within the walls of the mansion. As he gazed at the scene before him, Charles felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had been on, for the lessons he had learned, and for the future that now stretched out before him, filled with possibility. Sarah joined him at the window, her presence a welcome warmth by his side. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight bathed the garden in a soft, ethereal light. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice filled with the same sense of awe that Charles felt. He nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, it is," he replied, his voice thick with meaning. They shared a look, one that spoke of the journey they had been on together, and of the bond that had grown between them. A bond that went beyond words, rooted in the shared experience of something extraordinary. As the night fell and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Charles knew that his life had been forever changed. He had learned to accept what he could not understand, to find peace in the midst of uncertainty, and to trust in the unseen forces that had brought healing to his home. The renewal that had begun within him was now complete, and with it came a sense of purpose that he had not felt in a long time. He knew that there were still challenges ahead, still mysteries to unravel, but he no longer faced them with fear. Instead, he welcomed them, knowing that whatever came next, he was ready to face it, with Sarah, with Thomas, and with the unseen presence that had guided them all. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the Bennett household settled into a new normal, one that was marked by peace, love, and an unspoken understanding of the extraordinary events that had brought them to this point. Charles, who had once been a man ruled by logic and reason, now found himself embracing a deeper truth, one that transcended the material world. He had come to realize that the most powerful forces in life were often the ones that could not be seen or measured, but only felt. And chief among these forces was the power of unconditional love. Charles often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this place of acceptance. The pain of losing Eleanor, the fear of losing Thomas, and the strange, otherworldly experiences that had challenged everything he believed. All of these had led him to a place of profound understanding. He had learned that love, in its truest form, was not bound by the constraints of time or space. It was a force that connected the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen, in ways that defied explanation. It was this love that had brought Sarah into their lives, and it was this love that continued to guide them. The bond between Charles and Sarah deepened as they navigated this new chapter of their lives. They had both been through so much, and the experiences they had shared had forged a connection that was unbreakable. There was no need for words between them when it came to the extraordinary presence that lingered in the house. They both felt it, understood it, and accepted it as part of their lives. The love that Sarah had for her lost child, and the love that Charles had for his son, had intertwined in a way that had brought healing to them both. It was a love that transcended the boundaries of life and death, bringing them closer together with each passing day. Thomas, too, continued to flourish under the watchful care of both his father and Sarah. The boy who had once been so frail and weak was now a picture of health, his laughter and joy filling the house with a warmth that had been absent for so long. Charles marveled at the transformation, no longer questioning the miraculous changes that had taken place. He had learned to accept them with gratitude, understanding that they were the result of something far greater than himself. The love that surrounded Thomas, both from the living and the spirit that watched over him, was a testament to the power of love to heal, protect, and nurture. As the seasons changed, bringing with them the vibrant colors of autumn, Charles found himself more at peace than he had ever been. The grief that had once consumed him had been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He knew that Eleanor's memory would always be a part of him, but the pain of her loss had lessened, softened by the love that now filled his life. He often visited her grave, speaking to her as if she were still with him, sharing the events of their lives and the joy that Thomas brought him every day. He felt her presence in those moments, a comforting reminder that love never truly dies. Sarah, too, found comfort in the presence that continued to watch over them. She no longer mourned her son with the same intensity, knowing that he was still with her in a way that defied the limitations of the physical world. The knowledge that he was protecting Thomas, that his love had transcended death, brought her a peace that she had never thought possible. She knew that she had been given a gift, one that had allowed her to continue loving and caring for a child, even if it was not her own. And in caring for Thomas, she had found a sense of fulfillment that had eluded her for so long. The mansion, once a place of sorrow and fear, had become a home filled with love and laughter. The staff, who had once treaded carefully around the grief-stricken Charles, now moved about their duties with a lightness that reflected the joy that had returned to the household. There were still moments of quiet reflection, still nights when the shadows seemed to move a little differently, or the whispers returned. But these moments were no longer a source of fear. Instead, they were reminders of the love that had brought them all together, a love that continued to watch over them from beyond. As winter approached, bringing with it the first snow of the season, Charles found himself looking forward to the future with a sense of hope and anticipation. He knew that life would always have its challenges, but he also knew that he was no longer alone in facing them. He had Sarah, he had Thomas, and he had the unseen presence that had guided them all through the darkest times. The power of unconditional love had shown him that there was always light, even in the darkest of places, and that love could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and bring peace to even the most troubled of hearts. On a quiet evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Charles and Sarah sat together by the fire, Thomas nestled between them, fast asleep. The warmth of the flames, the soft glow of the lights, and the peaceful silence of the house created a moment of perfect contentment. Charles looked at Sarah, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "For everything." Sarah returned his smile, her eyes shining with emotion. "We did this together," she replied, her voice equally soft. "It was love that brought us here. It's what will keep us going." As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall, Charles felt a sense of closure and renewal. He knew that the journey they had been on was far from ordinary, but it had brought them to a place of extraordinary love and connection. And in that love, they had found the strength to move forward, to face whatever came next, and to do so together. The power of unconditional love had transformed their lives, bringing them peace, healing, and a future filled with hope. And as they sat together, watching the flames dance, they knew that this love, this connection, would carry them through whatever the future held. As the story of Charles, Sarah, and Thomas comes to a close, we invite you to reflect on the incredible power of love, love that transcends time, space, and even death. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to join us for more tales that explore the depths of the human spirit. Click the bell icon to receive notifications of our latest stories, and if you enjoyed this journey, please give the video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us, and if you'd like to help us continue bringing these stories to life, consider contributing through the Buy Me a Coffee link pinned in the comments. Thank you for being a part of our community, and we look forward to sharing more with you soon.